Hi everyone, I've been wanting to do a video on this for a little while. I've been wanting to pull together some of the things I've been thinking about, some of the themes and commonalities and things I've been studying to talk about fundamentalism. That's a word that gets thrown around in different historical settings frequently. I find that it can at times be a very helpful label, but more often than not, it can be very sloppily or lazily used, kind of just as a slur, and can be used with a lot of imprecision. Sometimes it can just be used as an insult to like label something you don't like. And so I've been really interested in fundamentalism, particularly as a Christian historical phenomenon for a while. I'm very, very interested in American religious history, especially in the kind of late 1800s to the up through the 1900s, the 20th century. I've always been really interested in that era. I've read a lot of books on that. And fundamentalism is a big part of that story. And so, given all of that study and given that area of interest in mine, and given some things that are happening culturally in 2024 as I record this, we're just after the election, and what I would argue, and I'm going to use this video to argue, is that there is a resurgent fundamentalism happening in our culture right now. But I mean that in a specific and precise way. I don't mean that as just a shallow denigration. And so what I want to do is I want to take this video to take some time to unpack what I see defines, makes up, points towards actual fundamentalist movements, particularly within Christianity is what I'm thinking of right now. And so I've identified, or I've labeled what I'm going to call 4 markers of fundamentalism that I think are very historically grounded and can be pointed to in historical study that I think are applicable to the fundamentalism that's kind of rearing its head today. And so I just want to talk through those markers. I want to talk about where I kind of get them from and what I see the definitions as, and also maybe make some connections to some of what I see this pointing to today, and then end with just some takeaway thoughts about how hopefully all of this could be helpful. But ultimately, I want to propose a careful and engaged and thoughtful definition of fundamentalism that I want to also be empathetic with it, to some of the roots of it, which is something I want to get into. So that's my goal in this video, is just to pose a really careful and thoughtful definition of fundamentalism and see what it has to do with what we're facing today. And so before I get that, I'm going to name my sources. So here are some. This is not all, but these are probably as I thought through how to talk about this, these are some of the books that lent me some language and historical perspective. I commend any and all of them that might be of interest to you. But I mean, huge for me, top shelf, big influence for me is George Marsden's study, American Fundamentalism in American Culture. It's a fantastic book, gold standard in my opinion, and it's well regarded for a reason. But also Mark Knoll's book, The Scandal of the Evangelical Mind, which is actually, you can see on my shelf right up here. That's another kind of modern classic for good reason. Knoll and Marsden contributed together, along with David Bebbington, another serious historical scholar, to an essay collection called Evangelicals. The subtitle is Who They Have Been, Are Now, and Could Be. I think that's a fantastic book. That has some of Bebbington's writings of the Bebbington Quadrilateral, if you've heard of that term. It's the only time I'm going to talk about Bebbington's Quadrilateral. I'm not really going to use it very much in this video. But that book of essays is really outstanding. I also really I'd recommend this one with some reservation, maybe not reservations, with just some qualifiers. But David Congdon's book is right behind me on my shelf here, Who is a True Christian? This is a really new book. It just came out this year, I believe. Really challenging, and the historical content in that book is very, very challenging and very good and really helpful to really push on. He lands in a place that I'm not necessarily on board with in terms of his proposals moving forward, but the historical work in that book is really, really excellent, and that pushed on my thinking in some key ways too. So that one was helpful. That's not an easy read though. A couple other ones here. A couple biographies that are really helpful. William Martin's biography of Billy Graham is very good. It's a little long. That one's behind me on my shelf back here somewhere too. It's a little. Oh yeah, you can see it right over my shoulder, right there. It is long, but it's sympathetic and critical, and in a really, really good way. And then also, I recently just read Barry Hankins' biography of Francis Schaeffer. That book is very excellent on understanding, because Francis Schaeffer kind of lived on the boundary of fundamentalism and neo-evangelicalism, and he lived right through those decades in the mid to late 1900s. That's a really instructive biography that gets at some of the tendencies I'm going to talk about in this video. Also, I could just get me talking about books, I could go the whole time. Dan Hummel's wonderful Rise and Fall of Dispensationalism. It might seem like it's adjacent because it's about dispensationalism, but American fundamentalism plays really, really prominently in that book, and that's an excellently written, wonderfully easy to read historical study. So that's Rise and Fall of Dispensationalism. Just two more, and then I'll limit myself. There. I really also like Dan Silliman's Reading Evangelicals, more about the book industry. That's a pretty entertaining book, but it's really, really insightful on evangelical culture, particularly how fiction publishing kind of built up an evangelical subculture. And then the last one, this is a little bit heavier, but Darren Jochuk's From the Bible Belt to the Sun Belt, about Southern California, the migration from kind of the South and Southwest into Southern California, and the crucible there that created the Billy Graham and others, Orange County and that whole area. Really, really interesting historical study and very carefully done. So those are the ones that come to the top of my thinking that have really formed my sense of historicizing fundamentalism. There's a lot of others I could go into, but those are really excellent books in different ways. And that's my works cited list. So I'm gonna put that at the top here. Chase down any of those, or if that sparks other interest or other books that you'd recommend, put them in the comments or whatever. But those are top shelf for me. So okay, having said all of that, now let's get into the actual definition of fundamentalism that I want to propose. And what I want to do is I want to propose 4 markers, and I labeled them A, B, C, D. So a nice mnemonic device to keep them at top of mind. These are the ABCs of fundamentalism. I want to talk through each of these 4 quickly, define it, talk a little bit about some of the trends in it, and then I want to at the end talk about how they come together to form what we see as fundamentalism. So here are the ABCs of fundamentalism according to me. The first one is anxious. Fundamentalism is an anxious response to social destabilization, to destabilizing social conditions. So, and that creates an understandable anxiety. This is a really important kind of Procrustean bed or a substructure, I would argue, of fundamentalism. When it surges, it's because social anxiety is high. In the story of American religion, fundamentalism emerged, especially with that label. It emerged with the label in the early 1900s, but arguably some of its antecedents were in the late 1800s. The fundamentals, as the book pamphlets that were published right before World War I, essentially. That's where the term fundamentalism, as in kind of the nomenclature, comes from. But the cultural preconditions were brewing, so to speak, for a couple decades. And in that era, if you are a history buff, or if you know that era in American history, the conditions were such for destabilization. So, notably, technological conditions were changing rapidly, creating urbanization and industrialization, and also there was a geographic displacement happening because people were moving to industrial centers because of jobs and because of technological changes and because of the possibility of wealth and all of that. So these major shifts created a destabilized kind of setting. Also importantly, it's not just technology and socio-political kind of changes, but there was also a scholarly change happening, and also media communications, which this prefigures our age a little bit. But media and communications were changing and rapidly advancing, and so the reason that matters is because German higher criticism of Scripture, for example, could actually move out of Germany across the world quickly, relatively speaking, certainly relatively speaking to what had happened before. And so these kind of new ideas, because of the new technologies, could proliferate in a quick way and contribute to the sense of destabilization. So all of these factors, and I'm barely skimming the surface of the history here, but all of these factors contributed to an anxiety. And so fundamentalism, one of these 4 characteristics, I'm going to argue, is anxiety, and I think that's really, really crucial. I'm not just talking about mental clinical anxiety. I'm talking about an anxiety of a loss of grounding, socially speaking, in terms of a population, like a loss of grounding, a loss of firm boundaries and firm foundations. All these changes contribute to anxiety. And so when anxiety exists, fundamentalism is going to, I think, historically, it's safe to argue fundamentalism is going to quickly follow behind. And so that happened in the late 1800s into the early 1900s, and I think it's happening today for many similar reasons. Technology, communications, all of that. Scholarly consensus on things, all of that stuff is changing in many ways in our lifetime. So, and yeah, I've already telegraphed that a little bit, but, in a century ago, it was the railroad, mass media communications, and geographical displacement and urbanization. Today, it's the internet, it's social media, it's the scholarly changes on accounting for history, the way that the university guild has really changed in terms of recognizing some of the limited ways it's approached study in terms of whose perspectives were represented in the guild. That's all changed. The scholarly kind of consensus around certain identitarian ideas has shifted in really, really rapid ways, and that has proliferated because of technological links to social media and the internet and blogs and everything else. That has really proliferated rapidly into normal people's lives, right? So there's a lot of parallels, and I don't want to overread that. You can do too simplistic historical jumps in that way, but I think it's undeniable. There's a lot of parallels in terms of the technological and social and political and geographic shifts that are happening in our time, and I think it's just brewing an anxious stew, and so it doesn't surprise me in a way that fundamentalism is resurgent. So that's the A. That's anxious. B is binary. The more maybe appropriate term to use for this would be dichotomized, but I needed a B word, so I changed it to binary. But binary is still helpful, and what I mean by this is simply that it's this dualistic binary view of the world. And I need to nuance this very carefully. I've talked about this in some other videos, but what I mean by this dichotomized view, this binary view, is a simplistic sense of people can be good or evil, or cultures can be good or evil, or people groups can be good or evil. And that's more of the binary that I'm getting at. Some commenters asked in other videos when you critique a binary or dichotomized view of the world, the concern there is, well, are you just kind of lapsing into a non-dualistic, relativistic, pluralistic kind of idea where there is no good and there is no evil, everything's gray, and that's not what I believe. I am a theist, I'm a Christian, I believe that there is a God, and I believe that God is good, and I believe that there is not good, and I believe there is evil, and I believe there are right ideas and there are wrong ideas. I do believe that philosophically. Theologically, I believe that. And so to push back on a binary view of the world is not to necessarily make the leap that there is no good or evil or right or wrong, right? Those are different conversations. What I am talking about is this simplistic binary, this simplistic dichotomization of the world, which is rooted, and Marsden argues this in his study, it's rooted on this kind of split level view of the world between spirit and earth, or this like upstairs, downstairs kind of simplistic view. If all of reality is kind of composed in this split level view, then you can start to approach the world in an overly simplistically binary way. So what I would propose, instead of a binary view is the famous Solzhenitsyn quote, which is the line between good and evil runs through every human heart. That's a helpful quote in so many ways, because he's not saying there is no good and evil. He's not getting rid of the binary of good and evil. He's just saying that identifying exactly where it lies within you is not always so simple. And it's certainly not the case that any human is wholly and holistically on the side of good, nor wholly on the side of evil. That's where he affirms the binary in kind of a big sense, an idealistic sense, but then also pushes back on our ability to so cleanly and simplistically and easily locate that boundary in our world and in our lived lives and our experiences. I also think of Jesus's parable of, I know this is not what the parable was about, but I think it's very applicable, of the wheat and the tares, or the wheat and the weeds. He says when he teaches that story, of the story of these like evil kind of bandits throwing bad seed into a farmer's field so that weeds grow up amongst all the wheat. He tells his followers, like, if you go out and try to root out all the bad weeds, you're going to pull up the good crops as well. So just let them all grow and essentially let God kind of sort it all out at the end of time. I think about that parable a lot when I think about this aspect of fundamentalism, which is this overly rigid, certain binary dichotomization of the world and of reality, and also of one's ability to appropriately suss out the differences there. So the tonic, or the pushback to that overly binary view, is, I think, that Solzhenitsyn quote, or that, Jesus' teachings. And I just want to say that you can see that binary view in resurgent fundamentalism today, just as you could a century ago, in these simplistic characterizations of entire cultures. This was something that Francis Schaeffer took some flack for, was his overly simplistic kind of renderings of Western thought or Western civilization in some of his works, kind of categorizing them in all one simplistic way. Francis Schaeffer is a more careful thinker than just a lot of rote, fundamentalists were, but I think that his tendencies there kind of help point us towards some of the way that this worldview plays out. Also, I stumbled upon, as I was reviewing Shepherds for Sale and doing some of my thinking about that book, I stumbled upon a video online of, in this case it was Megan Basham, identifying who were the pastors that you could trust versus the pastors you could not. And I'm not going to go into depth on it, but I was struck by the dualistic, simplistic, binary nature of even that framing of the question. And so essentially what she and then this interviewer did was they would throw a pastor on the screen and then say, based on a couple of these things this pastor said, are they trustworthy or not? They'd be labeled simplistically trustworthy or not. And so there's that binary thing at work, and I would argue it is a fundamentalist tendency. Okay, moving on to the third mark, which is, so the first mark was anxious, anxiety-fueled, binary or dichotomized view of reality. And then third is conversionist, or Marsden's term is revivalistic. So conversionism is something that has been noted by people like David Bebbington for a long time as something that marks evangelicalism as a movement. All that means is that one of the goals of the movement is to call for conversion, to call for change, for repentance, for a spiritual move from one category to another category, and to believe that kind of conversion can happen. And so what I want to say, this one's also needs to be nuanced a bit. I actually believe in conversion as a spiritual experience. I believe it's a thing that happens. I believe it's a worthwhile thing to share stories of conversion and to hear stories of conversion, and renewal is a word I prefer. And so I'm not trying to wholesale dismiss any of these pillars. More so what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to paint kind of a constellation, to mix my metaphors, a constellation of factors that contribute, all interlock towards fundamentalism. And conversionism or revivalism is one piece of this puzzle. So you can see this historically in figures like a Dwight Moody or a Billy Sunday leading up to the 1900s. You can see it very clearly in the explosion of Pentecostalism. I mean, that's a very conversionistic, revivalistic kind of movement, and the way that movement has impacted so much spirituality, particularly in Christianity throughout the globe. But of course, Billy Graham was a revivalistic preacher, conversionistic preacher. So all of these figures and movements point to the kind of emergence of, Christians have believed in conversion for a long time, so I don't want to say that it simplistically started right in the 1900s, early 1900s, but there was a particular emphasis on methods of conversion and calling for conversions in certain ways and practicing it and institutionalizing it and measuring it. These kinds of markers are a little bit more modern or contemporary in history, and they mark a certain way of approaching spirituality that is bound up with fundamentalism, with American fundamentalism. And it kind of builds off of that binary dichotomized worldview. I don't like the term worldview, I keep using it, but paradigm, I guess you could say. They build off of that paradigm because if reality is dichotomized and there is good and there is evil and there is spirit and flesh and there is God and Satan, then it makes sense that conversion is going to be really important, because you're going to want to call people out of the bad into the good, and you're going to want to be in the good yourself, and so you're going to want to have a measurable conversion experience that you can point to and be assured or publicly demonstrate your membership in the good of the binary, right? So these things do build off of each other in really important ways. And I would say that conversionism, also another thing I haven't mentioned, is it's very individualized too in our current kind of cultural moment in our setting. It's individualized, it's demonstrated, it's a switch, in that binary way. But the conversionism thing is a really important piece of this kind of this landscape. And then last, so anxious, binary, conversionistic, and then divisive. That's the D, the ABCD. So the other word is militant. A lot of fundamentalistic writings are marked by combative, pugilistic, militant metaphors, images, spiritual battle, spiritual warfare is really important. Intense focus on waging fights in the kind of arena, the cultural arena, because a lot of, again, that back to that dichotomized view, the fight is against spirit, against evil in the spiritual realm that is manifested in our culture and in our kind of physical, geopolitical, or whatever realm today. So the fight is spiritual, but it's manifested in this life and in this place. And so there's a really intense focus on fighting and defeating evil in ways that are measurable and visible and you can point to. And I think that is also a really important piece of the puzzle that you can start to identify and diagnose where fundamentalism is resurgent. And this is very true. Like the pamphlets of the fundamentals, where the name fundamentalism comes from, they were not divisive or combative, but in the increasing kind of intensity and rancor of the split between the fundamentalists and the modernists in the 1900s, like people like Billy Hargis or Carl McIntyre in particular were very, very, very combative and called for kind of a combative, Bob Jones is another one, called for a combative kind of way of being in the world. And then you can trace a line from them up to the Jerry Falwells and the modern, the moral majority. Certain elements of it, not all of it, were as combative. And then I think you can point to, examples of that today. I mean, and I don't want to harp on Shepherds for Sale too much, but in my review of that, I talked and I quoted her when she says at the end of the book that we are at open war, or Vodi Baucham's Fault Lines also has a very similar kind of, we need to wage a fight because disaster is coming on us. So there are current examples of this militant, divisive, combative way of approaching a kind of a methodology. And so those are my proposed ABCDs. I'm going to repeat them, and I'm going to make a few comments on the combination of these things. Like when they combine, I just had the image of Voltron come into my head. When they build together, it really creates something that is, it's significant. It's potentially dangerous. It's very important to be aware of. And so again, those are, anxiety is kind of the bedrock. I think in the setting of cultural anxiety, where mores and standards and traditions are questioned and shifting, there's going to be a lot of need for certainty and need for assurance. And so off of that, kind of a proposed binary view of the world of reality in which good and evil can be simplistically diagnosed, a conversionistic practice in which the mission is to get out of the bad, be in the good, and call others to do the same. And don't do the Solzhenitsyn thing where there's the line is in me, it's outside of me, and I need to be on the good side, and kind of an anxious approach. And then all of that is kind of cloaked in this divisive or militant or combative language and metaphor and leadership. That, I think, are the markers of fundamentalism, particularly in our time and place. And so in a previous video, when those things combine, in a previous video when I was commenting on the dispute between Elisa Childers and Preston Sprinkle, I used two terms of purity-based separatism and anti-intellectualism as markers of fundamentalism. And I want to loop back to those because I actually what I just went through are the four things that I would say are the underpinnings that actually create a movement that is then marked on the surface, or the iceberg that pokes above the water is a purity-based separatist and anti-intellectualist movement. And I think all these things can lend some explanatory kind of reasoning behind why that happens. So again, if you think about purity-based separatism is marked by a need to be seen and to demonstrate one's purity, and to hold impurity at a distance. And in this case, that's built on this binary view, and impurity is defined by whatever is outside of the kind of certainty-driven narratives that you are subscribing to. So preserving the truthfulness, the sanctity, and the reliability of one's conversion experience, the story there is also plays a part in that. And then the separatism or the schismatic kind of tendencies leverage the divisive and the combative and the militant metaphors and language and leadership, right? To the ends of keeping ourselves pure, because we're in an anxious time. And so to combat or to kind of soothe the anxiety, these are these things we can point to that evidence that we are in the right in this anxious time. And so to kind of tamp down the temperature there, fundamentalists will practice I would argue, practice a purity-based separatism. So historically, the fundamentalists were extremely, extremely separatistic, schismatic, to the extent of like a second-order schismatism, this was like Francis Schaeffer in that Hankins biography. He talks about Schaeffer was critiqued by fundamentalists for not being schismatic enough. So he kind of rode that line between these extremes. But what they would critique him for, people like McIntyre in particular critiqued him for this, is that he wouldn't separate himself from people who were not separatists. So people who were more ecumenically minded, there's like multiple orders of separating yourself here. If you are willing to associate with people who are willing to associate with people that are quote unquote bad on the bad side of the binary, then he was smeared as not being really committed to the movement enough. That is the extreme of this kind of schismatic nature, and it's showing up today. I mentioned that YouTube video about which pastors you can trust. I've also I know Elisa Childers, for example, has commented that she will not have a conversation with Brian Zond because he is so dangerous. That is another purity kind of schismatic approach towards things. The utter refusal to have a conversation with somebody, for example. And I don't want to harp too much on that one example. That's just one small example, but it points to this broader tendency that again, my point in making this video is to kind of look out and diagnose what's happening and to kind of see how it plays out around us. And then that leads to the other thing I want to talk about, which is the anti-intellectualism. So I talked about this in that other video, and I'm just going to briefly comment on it here. And actually, that Elisa Childers example I just mentioned is emblematic of this, because to be anti-intellectual is to not be against ideas per se, or it's not to be dumb or not be smart. Like, there are anti-intellectuals who are educated and smart and very articulate. That's not what anti-intellectualism is. Anti-intellectualism is to refuse the risk of learning or refuse the risk of potentially being wrong in public in particular. And so I would say Eric Metaxas is an example of this. Whenever he, for example, gets critiques from Bonhoeffer scholars about his biography, and he outright says, I just don't listen to the critiques. He writes them off as just out to lunch because they clearly don't get Bonhoeffer, so they're not even worth engaging with. That is anti-intellectualism, and Metaxas is not a dumb person. He's a smart person, but he is anti-intellectual in his refusal to engage with ideas in a risky, vulnerable, truly humble sense. Like, the refusal to engage, the refusal to have conversation, the refusal to have back and forth and good faith critique, is what I'm talking about. And so I would argue that anti-intellectualism is an outgrowth of these four markers of fundamentalism, because, again, if you're anxious, if you have a dichotomized view of everything in the world, if you're conversionistic in your impulses, and you're divisive in your militancy and you're separatist, you're not going to engage peer-to-peer, head-to-head. You're just not going to engage in a healthy, fruitful way, because that kind of militates, to use that term, against everything else that your movement's about. And it's not going to further the goals of providing an anti-anxious tonic in an anxious time. You need to just be right and be clear and be assured and be certain and provide that for everyone that's following you. So, final comments here. Why am I doing all this? I'm not doing this to dismiss or belittle or condescend to fundamentalism. I hope that's not what is coming out of this video. I hope that you're not sensing that from me. I'm really doing this for a few reasons. One is to historicize everything. I find it personally extraordinarily helpful to remember that this has happened before, and we can see the markers of it, and we can see where those things lead. And I would say that we're seeing a resurgent fundamentalism with all the same markers, and there's some of the same cultural, phenomena that are fueling it in our time. And so if history is any teacher, then we know that this fundamentalism is going to continue to fragment. I think there's probably going to be a lot more infighting, because that purity-based thing it's going to turn in on itself, and people are going to turn in on the ranks and try to separate from those who are not pure enough as cultural anxiety continues. And there might be a movement that tries to pull out the middle, like the neo-evangelicals did with a la Billy Graham and such. and a little bit like Francis Schaeffer. There might be some that try to hold the middle, but that's going to be a very hard line to hold publicly in this cultural anxiety. So that's what happened historically, and with if the same thing's happening again, I think that we're going to likely see some of the same phenomena happen again. And so that is, I think that could be helpful just to kind of locate everything historically. Also, it's really important for me to have empathy for the movement, and the part that I can empathize the most with is the anxiety foundation. We are living in anxious times, and it can be very helpful to empathize with that anxiety as much as possible, is to understand people who get, and there's a difference between leaders of fundamentalism and followers of fundamentalism too. And so I'm much more empathetic with a follower of a fundamentalistic movement, or a fundamental follower of a leader, someone who gets who buys into the certainty and the assurance because of anxiety, because of acute cultural, political anxiety. And I think it's really important, if you're someone like me who doesn't think fundamentalism is healthy or a good outgrowth of Christianity and doesn't want to see it gain influence, it can be helpful to empathize with those who are attracted to it for various reasons. And historicizing it and then empathizing with it, I think, are really important steps we can take on the way towards understanding it and towards resisting it. And that is ultimately the call for me, my little kind of humble corner of the world and the influence I have in whatever corners I have. I want to confidently, non-anxiously resist the allures of fundamentalism. And so for me, that doesn't mean I'm going to stop calling for conversion. I actually think conversion out of fundamentalism was a really good thing, which would be a conversion towards a humble, soft-hearted, more, I almost said the word nuanced, but fundamentalists hate the term nuanced, but like a more precision-oriented way of thinking, and a humble way of thinking that takes Solzhenitsyn and Jesus' teachings truly to heart. Not be simplistic binary in how we identify and locate ourselves or our movements. But resisting all of those markers, I think resisting anxiety, resisting simplistic binaries, resisting overly confident conversion, although I still believe in conversion, like I said, and then also really resisting that divisive, combative rhetoric and thinking, resisting all of that will, I argue, keep you away from anti-intellectualism and purity-based schismatic approaches and separatisms. And will, I think, result in a healthier practice of community and a healthier practice of Christianity in our time. And it may not build big platforms, it may not explode in growth, it may not explode in numbers. That's out of my control anyways. As a person who affirms the sovereignty of God, I can have a lot of peace with that. But I guess what I want to end on is just saying, let's together, in whatever place you're in, if you're watching this video and you resonate with what I'm saying, let's resist the call of fundamentalism. And let's practice, if you are Christian, let's practice a more generous, a more gracious, but always confident and non-anxious way of following Christ in the world. And so that's a good note to end on, I think. As always, thank you for taking a few minutes to watch. I hope that this was helpful to you.